Imagine you're talking to an atheist, and they say, "Do you eat shellfish?" You tell them you do, and they say, "Well, doesn't the Bible say that eating shellfish is an abomination?" Well, of course it does, but right off the bat you know that this atheist didn't learn the Bible from a minister. He doesn't know the first thing about the Bible. He doesn't understand the difference between Mosaic law and the New Covenant. Now, you can try to explain this to him all you'd like, but if he's already made up his mind that he's right and you're wrong, and that somehow he understands the Bible better than you do, he's not going to approach you with an open mind. He's going to say everything you say is a cop-out, and he's not going to give it a fair hearing. If someone really wants to understand the Bible, who should they go to? An atheist or a skeptic like Sam Harris or Richard Dawkins? People who say they understand it, but who never went to seminary and don't even believe it? No, the Bible is complex, with many messages which, improperly understood, could lead one to a false understanding of God's Word. If you want to understand the Bible, you go to a minister or theologian, someone who believes it, someone who understands the big picture and can explain it in context. Evolution is very much the same thing. It's complex. It isn't easily understood. If you want to learn what evolution truly claims, you shouldn't go to Ken Ham or to a creationist, but to an evolutionary biologist, someone who has dedicated their life to understanding it and who believes it. Now, you don't have to believe what they tell you, but at least you know you'll be getting the correct information from the horse's mouth. Even other scientists, like physicists or engineers, usually aren't qualified to give in-depth answers about evolution. It simply isn't their field. Evolution is not simply a fact. It's a theory. You may think that a theory is what you see on television, a cop who says that he has a theory of the crime, or a lawyer who has a theory of the case. But the word theory actually means something extraordinarily different in science. In science, theories are much bigger than laws. They're much bigger than facts, and they are in fact the highest form of knowledge one can have. Every scientist dreams of making a theory. That's the end goal, but only a very few rare geniuses ever succeed in doing it. Gravity is just a theory, but nobody would say it's not true or that it's just a guess. Atomic theory powers our country and destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. If you think germ theory is just a theory, stop washing your hands and tell your doctor he doesn't need to use sterile equipment before surgery. The theory of relativity is so powerful it allowed us to land a man on the moon and bring him back alive again in one piece. But theories aren't simple things. They're complex and can only be understood as a whole. When viewed as individual little parts, it looks silly, and just like many pieces of the Bible. You need context to understand the full picture. And, like the Bible, you're not going to grasp it in 5 or 10 minutes. If you've ever dismissed evolution as just a theory, or asked, if evolution is real, why are there still monkeys, or argued that, hey, it doesn't show how life started, or pointed out that there are no transitional fossils, or suggested that an elephant can come from an ear of corn, you're making statements just as ignorant as the atheist who says, well, if God loves us, why does he send people to hell? In fact, all fossils are transitional fossils. Evolution does not try to explain how life started, and most importantly, evolution, in fact, does not allow for one kind of animal to become another kind of animal. When a biologist says a different kind of animal, what they really mean is just a new species, but all species are always the same kind. No animal has become a different kind of animal, and if one ever did, evolution would be dead as a theory. Corn will always produce other kinds of corn, and elephants always will produce another kind of elephant. And if none of this makes sense to you, if you think this is all contrary to what you understand about evolution, then you have been grossly misinformed. The idea of evolution has been around since the ancient Greeks. They noticed that they could breed animals and select for strength, stamina, or speed, depending on what they needed. Using what they learned, we've invented entirely new species of crops like wheat and corn, neither of which exist in nature. The process of making these things is called artificial selection. When a species reproduces, there are tiny random changes in traits. We select the traits that are desirable, breed those, while ignoring the ones we don't want. The shorter the life cycle of the plant or animal, the faster we can do this. With crops, we can see significant changes quite quickly. With animals, it takes a lot longer. It occurred to the Greeks that perhaps all living things evolve, and that one species can turn into another over time. The problem is that since all these traits were random, it won't work without something guiding the process of selecting the more desirable traits over the less desirable ones. This was a problem that went unsolved until a man by the name of Charles Darwin made a startling discovery. He realized that there was in fact a natural process for selecting these traits. He called this natural selection. Darwin began mapping species, figuring out their origin, and trying to establish where they came from, based on how they interacted in the environment. He was so successful at this, he was able to predict new species that nobody had ever seen before. The evolution of the star orchid, he realized, couldn't have occurred unless there was a moth with a 2-foot tongue flying around somewhere. He was laughed out of the scientific community for that claim, and yet shortly after his death, that moth was actually found. But he also discovered that the further back in time he went, the more these ancestors started to look a lot like each other. He realized that by going back far enough, species all came from a common ancestor. Now, Darwin was a Christian, and this was not the answer he was looking for. Indeed, this threw him into a crisis of faith. It put him at odds with his friends, his family, his community, to say nothing of the fact that scientists thought it was ludicrous. But he continued and pretty soon created a rudimentary tree of life. Now, we use the tree of life to map which species came from where and how every species is related to each other. It looks complicated, but really it's no different from a family tree. We as species have ancestors, we have cousins, we have distant cousins, and just like your family tree, where no member can jump from one branch to another, no kind of species can actually jump from one kind or one branch to another kind. Now, people argue that because there are gaps in our knowledge, that proves it's not true. But gaps don't disprove anything. There are gaps in the Bible. The Bible doesn't record every reign of every king. It doesn't record the ancestry of absolutely every person from Adam to Paul. Jesus, whose life and death is literally the topic of the New Testament, and the Bible doesn't even record when he was born, when he died, or where he was buried. Now, does that mean that Jesus wasn't real? Does it mean the crucifixion wasn't real? Of course not. Gaps in our knowledge doesn't disprove evolution. If you want to disprove evolution, you have to find predictions that it makes that in fact turns out to be false. Any one genuine contradiction is enough to bring the entire system down. If you find a kangaroo fossil in the wrong sedimentary layer or dated to the wrong time, it's over. Find an amphibian fossil that's older than the oldest fish fossil, and evolution is dead and buried. Find a mammal that has feathers anywhere in the world, and evolution is gone. But after millions of species cataloged, after trillions of fossils found, not one has contradicted the theory as we understand it. What's more, the theory of evolution explains biological mysteries that have gone unanswered for millennia. The laryngeal nerve is a nerve that connects your voice box to your brain. Your voice box is only about 3 inches away from the base of your skull, but rather than go directly there, this nerve actually goes in the wrong direction, all the way down to your heart, under the aorta, and back up again to your brain, traveling roughly 2 feet to hit a target that's 3 inches away. All mammals have this nerve, and in a giraffe it's over 12 feet long. The vagus nerve does the same thing, and should go straight from your spinal cord to your diaphragm, but instead heads up from your lungs to the base of the skull. This is one of the reasons you get the hiccups, is because this nerve is not intelligently designed. Many of the nerves in your body, in fact, take indirect routes to where they're trying to get to. But if you go back through our evolution, what you'll see is that the nerves start getting closer and closer, and the routes become far more direct. Look at our earliest amphibian ancestors, and you'll realize that all the nerves take direct routes. It's only after that amphibian starts to grow from a 4-legged animal to a 2-legged animal and walk upright that these nerves get dragged throughout the entire body to accommodate these changes as they're being made. We have tailbones. Whales have hip bones and a ball and socket joint. Again, if you understand the evolution of whales, you'll see both why they have these bones and why they've atrophied so much over time. Evolution has been used to successfully predict new species, explain mysteries we previously didn't understand, taught us how to combat disease, and even allowed us to create new organisms to fit specific needs. It's confirmed by multiple independent and unrelated fields of science, from embryology to archaeology to comparative anatomy, and been verified by independent scientists in every industrialized country in the world. Evolution had already been proven when, in 1953, we discovered DNA. What would the DNA show us? Would it disprove the theory or undermine it in some way? Well, once we sequenced the DNA, we found that the genetic material produced another tree of life. It's a second map produced completely independently in a completely unrelated field that reached all of the same conclusions. Only this one was far more detailed and allowed us to fill in many of the gaps that we hadn't understood before. Now, imagine please for a moment a rainbow. If I were to ask you how many colors are in that rainbow, you might say 7. But in reality, there's an infinite number of colors in a rainbow. For convenience, we say 7, but that rainbow actually contains every color imaginable. And while each color is different, each color also blends into the other colors. Red becomes orange, becomes yellow, becomes green, becomes blue, becomes indigo, becomes violet. If you look at the entire rainbow, red ultimately transitions to violet. And if I ask you to point to the place where red officially becomes orange, you can't do it. It's a progression. There's no one point where you can say that before this point it's red and after this point it's orange. Where does orange become yellow? Where does yellow become green? You can't do it. You can't point to a single discrete spot where these things happen. The same is true for evolution. Sure, we declare a species to start here or end there, but there's always wiggle room either way, and it's usually impossible to point to a definitive beginning or end of any particular species. No one generation is completely incompatible with its recent ancestors, but enough time passes and they drift further and further into a new species. All evolution is microevolution, just tiny changes which accrue over time, and when a sufficient number of these changes have occurred, we declare that we have witnessed macroevolution. But that's just a word. It's a convenient way of defining stages of the evolutionary process. If you believe in microevolution, that's the ballgame. Macroevolution is simply an arbitrary distinction we use for classification. To ask an evolutionist to point to the precise point where an ape became a man is a false argument. It's a straw man. There is no precise point. There never has been. Nobody ever argued there would be, and that's simply not how evolution works. These skulls here are a progression of human evolution, and while there is definitely significant change over time, and the first generation is completely incompatible with the last generation, there is no definitive point at which one can say a new species occurred. What's more, if you look at the tree of life, you'll see that there is never an instance where one kind of species has actually become another kind of species. That can't happen. It doesn't work that way. An ear of corn simply cannot turn into an elephant. No members of one branch of the tree can jump to another branch of the tree. Think about Abraham. Abraham and Sarah had many descendants. The children of these descendants will always be descendants of Abraham and Sarah. So will their children, and so on and so forth, no matter who they marry or what new branches are created on their family tree. Likewise, the descendants of Abraham and Hagar will also always be descendants of Abraham and Hagar. And while all of these ancestors share a common ancestry with Abraham, some are related to Hagar and others are related to Sarah. At no point can a descendant of Sarah give birth to a descendant of Hagar. It can't happen. The tree of life works the exact same way. Any descendants of corn will always be a kind of corn. You can get new species of corn and maybe get something that looks completely different, but it will always be a kind of corn. Anyone who says that an ear of corn can turn into a whale or a tomato doesn't understand how evolution works or is deliberately strawmanning it to make it look silly. This is us on the tree of life. No matter how much we evolve, no matter how much we change, no human being will ever produce an animal that is not a kind of human being. Beings came from apes. Therefore, we are also a kind of ape. Apes are a kind of primate, so we are primates too. All primates are a kind of mammal. This makes us a kind of mammal. All mammals are a kind of animal, so we are also a kind of animal, and our descendants will also be animals, and no matter how much we evolve or how much time you put into it, none of them will ever be a plant or a fish. And since all animals are eukaryotes, we are also eukaryotes. Evolution has been proven true time and time and time again. It's made predictions. It's explained holdovers like the tailbone, the laryngeal nerve, and hip bones in aquatic mammals like whales. And in fact, the vast majority of Christians believe it. Catholics, Protestants, Orthodox, they all accept evolution as true and that it doesn't contradict the Bible. That in fact, it's the means by which God works to make us the way we are today. Dr. Robert Carter in the Journal of Creation actually showed how mutations might not even be random, but instead pre-encoded by God into our DNA. There's no reason this has to contradict anyone's faith. The question is, does the evidence support it? The evidence for evolution is staggering across multiple independent and unrelated fields of research and concords with any new evidence we find. And with a near infinite number of defeaters that would destroy the theory, not one has been shown to work. Instead, with every new discovery, the tree of life becomes clearer, more precise, and better understood. And if you want to understand it, truly understand it, and learn for yourself whether or not it's true, don't talk to a creationist, don't talk to a physicist, talk to an expert, learn directly from the horse's mouth, and see why so many of your Christian brothers and sisters believe it and still love and hold their Bible dear. Thank you.